Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is David and today we are going to talk about autonomy supported teaching. Let's get into it. So we're going to begin by looking at the following figure. So on the top row, we have our regulatory styles. In the middle row, we have associated processes. And along the bottom row, we have perceived locus of causality. And moving between the left and the right columns is the continuum of relative autonomy. And this is how we're going to be framing our conversation today, because we're going to be talking about the challenges and benefits of moving your students, or rather anybody you work with, across this continuum of autonomy. So we need to begin by answering the question, what is autonomy? And more specifically, what is supporting autonomy in a classroom? Now, the concept of autonomy support means that an individual in a position of authority, like a teacher, takes somebody else's perspective. They acknowledge the other's feelings and provides the other with pertinent information and opportunities for choice while minimizing the use of pressures and demands. Minimizing pressure and demands. That's going to come up later. Another way to think of autonomy in the classroom is defining it with respect to a behavior set that an individual may exhibit that holds implications for the formation of self-determined regulations. These are things like eliciting and acknowledging perspectives, supporting self-initiative, offering choice, providing relevant information, and minimizing pressure and control. Again, the word pressure comes up. So let's take a look at some examples of how this can be put into action in a classroom setting. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is being called student focus. Now, what this looks like is when a teacher is more interested in the ideas of their students versus their own ideas, and that you almost always let kids do things their own way and ask the students first how they want to do things. You try to help them do it the way they want to do it. The next thing we're going to talk about is your interpersonal tone. Tone accounts for everything. The majority of communication is non-verbal, so your tone in a classroom setting is naturally very important. Teachers partly communicate their understanding through what they say, but they also communicate their understanding through vocal intonations and non-verbal gestures. What's really interesting to me about this is that we as teachers may employ a certain tone without actually being cognizant of how our tone is coming off to others, and that we might have feelings that we first have not recognized within ourselves that we're inherently passing off to other people just by speaking. Those human beings on the other side of your verbal communication may be subconsciously picking up on those subtle intonations of your speech, and it could, in either direction, make them comfortable or less comfortable with you, but they might not even realize that their brains are picking up on those cues. So this naturally becomes paramount when thinking about how we interact with other people. Our tone accounts for so much. The next thing we're going to talk about is perspective taking. So not that dissimilar to empathy, perspective taking is the active considerations of others' mental states and subjective experiences. If a teacher prepares or delivers a lesson without taking the student's perspective, the odds increase dramatically that students' need for autonomy will either be neglected or frustrated. This again is another one of those really nuanced things where you may be interacting with a group of students, or maybe just one that is getting frustrated with a task. And something that I see a lot of educators fall into is that they want to have a very open communication with that student, which is good. But oftentimes, the students cannot communicate their frustration because they're not watching this video. Most students do not have the language to be able to describe, or even the mental acuity to dig down into their subconscious to figure out why they're frustrated. So while it is important to listen to your students, it can actually perpetuate their frustration when you ask them, why are you frustrated? A really big part of perspective taking is to be able to look at all the confounding variables within a student's experience in a classroom, and sometimes that might not have anything to do with you. Maybe you're student focused, maybe your interpersonal tone is fantastic, but maybe the student is frustrated because of something that is out of your control and out of their realm to be able to describe. Because sometimes perspective taking is removing all of the judgment and being able to meet a student where they are, even if it has nothing to do with what you're asking them to. The next step is supporting intrinsic motivation. Now, we've talked about intrinsic motivation before, but let's get a little refresh. Intrinsic motivation is a naturally occurring motivation towards exploration, spontaneous interest, activity engagement, and environmental mastery. Now, this can be done in two distinct ways, and they both have uses in an educational setting. So let's take a look at them. Number one, pursuing personal interests. So this is when teachers invite students to pursue their personal interests, so they don't feel like pawns that have to do something that somebody else wanted them to do. They feel that they have self-authored the task. They have full volition to experience a sense of ownership over their own behavior, and they can engage with any kind of content with with an authentic sense of wanting to do that very task. Now, when you're supporting people in an educative setting to foster this idea of internal motivation through personal interest, it can be a bit of a slippery slope, because a counter argument to this is, what if my students are never intrinsically motivated to learn algebra? What if they're not interested in learning the life cycle of a frog? Well, no matter the creativity you can bring to the table as a lesson planner, there are going to be some things that you're not going to be able to make interesting to every student in the room. Because before choice can be expected to translate into autonomy and satisfaction, it needs to be accompanied by the presence of additional autonomy supportive acts of instruction. So these are the things that we've been talking about so far: perspective taking, monitoring your interpersonal tone, and being focused on the students. Because in order for students to want to do something, it needs to be meaningful to them. They need to be able to explore an interest, pursue a personal goal, or express an identity. And students need to feel competent and informed enough to make that choice. So while you may not get every student interested in learning about the water cycle, you can prime them to step out of their comfort zone and try new things by supporting that intrinsic motivation during the tasks that they are intrinsically motivated to do. So these are things like focusing on effort instead of outcome, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The next step is supporting internalization. So when students do not understand or appreciate why the teacher is making a request of them, they tend to view the request as arbitrary or as meaningless busy work. And this, my dear friends, is not exclusive to that of a student in a classroom. I do believe this is human nature, because teachers also do not like extra paperwork. Nobody likes to do something that they don't clearly see a defined goal on the other side. If you don't know where you're going, if you don't have an interest in what you are doing, you're not going to be motivated to do so. And I think it's quite misguided to take a task that you know is busy work, you know is pointless, and try to fabricate a reason for why students should be interested in it. If the human beings that you are leading are not interested in doing something and it's modifiable, it's changeable, ask them how. One of my go-to things as an educator, most of my experience was in an elementary classroom. What I would do is I would come to a classroom with all of my documents, unit plans, lesson plans. I'd have everything developed and ready to go. But I would sit my students down with the set of outcomes that I needed to achieve within that class. And we would briefly talk about every single one, and I would give them some cryptic examples of what that would look like in order for them to show their learning so that I could meet my obligations as a classroom teacher. But then we would brainstorm, and I would say, okay, how are you going to prove this to me? If somebody walked into this room and said, David, how do you know these kids know this thing? How would you answer that? What would you do? And I would take their examples and we would modify things and put them all together, create a Google Doc and have it up on the screen behind me. And we would create different options for how we were going to meet those goals. And then the students were free to choose what they wanted. And then at the very end of all of that collaboration, I would show them what I had designed. And I would say, if you want to do what I've made, awesome. If you want to do what we have made, you can do that as well. Just make a choice. And most often, nobody chose what I brought to the table, which is good. That's good. That's part of this, right? As much perspective as I take to be able to meet those kids where they are, it's going to be more interesting to them if they were a part of the creation. So coming prepared with lessons is something that's important, yes, even though they were almost never used through this lens of supporting autonomy in the classroom. But then it was so interesting because then I would build off of their ideas for the next year, and then they would build off those ideas for the next year. And it just, over time, it was this collaboration amongst students that potentially didn't even know each other across generations of time. It was really fascinating, because even looking down at my notes here, the ways in which that you learn from students, if you can give them autonomy, is fascinating. If you are actually present, willing, and open to listen to the ideas and thoughts of your students, you will inherently become a better person as well. If you look at teaching or working and leading other humans around in this world, if you look at that from a top-down authoritarian approach, you're not just doing them a disservice, you're also doing yourself a disservice. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So back to the notes. The next one is patience. I recently went through all the cards and notes that I received when I was a classroom teacher, and it really stuck out to me is that a lot of people noted my patience. I do have a Christ-like capacity for patience. I do. Patience is so important, and it's not some manufactured sense of how you're going to show up in any given moment. It has to truly be who you are as a person. So let's look at what I wrote in my notes. Patience is the optimistic calmness a teacher shows as students struggle to start adjust, and change their behavior. Displaying patience means giving students the time and space they need to work at their own pace and in their own way, and allowing students' thinking, answers, behaviors, performances, and internalization attempts to exist in an unfinished state. This goes back to what we were talking about before about praising effort versus final outcome. Of course, circumstances make it easy to understand why teachers are sometimes not patient. There are time constraints, high stakes testing, cultural norms, low funding of public schools in Alberta. There are so many things that limit our ability to foster patience, not only as classroom teachers, but as individuals living in our world. But the reason to be patient from a motivational perspective comes from a deep valuing of the student's autonomy and understanding that meaningful gains in cognitive development, so things like elaborating, paraphrasing, critical thinking, and conceptual learning, so things like conceptual change, cognitive accommodation, deep information processing, and behavior change take time and require multiple iterations and revisions. So while being patient, the teacher awaits a student-generated signal that the teacher's help and guidance would be appreciated. Because sometimes I think we view patience as not flying off the handle and not yelling at a group of kids. And while yes, that amount of patience for you to not become aggressive as a classroom teacher is important, and in my opinion, the bare minimum of human behavior, there's another really important layer of patience that I don't think a lot of folks are able to exemplify in a classroom setting, and that is when students need help. When do students need help? When do you help a student? Do you see a student struggling and immediately go over and solve their problem? I guess it's all left up to context, because your individual relationship with every student would inform at what point you intervene. But in order to build those resiliency skills and in turn somebody's sense of internal motivation and supporting their autonomy, let them struggle. Let them struggle so much. But the important part is that you have set up this relationship with your students that they know how to communicate with you when they're done struggling. They need to be able to have that tap out moment of, I'm frustrated now. The world is frustrating. Everything is frustrating. So they need to be able to have those emotional regulation skills to be able to recognize within themselves that they are frustrated. Maybe it's time to take a break. And the learning that happens in those breaks, if you're head down writing something focused on figuring out a problem and you can't do it, and you get frustrated enough to tap out and go and take a walk to the water fountain to go and see the fish, whatever it is, that break in there is the most important. That's that stamina building in there, because with a different environment, you're standing, you're walking, maybe you're taking a drink of water, that's when new perspective comes in. And it's hard not to jump in when you see somebody struggling, because I'm the classroom teacher. I'm supposed to help them. This child is obviously struggling with this thing, so why wouldn't I jump in to help them? Well, let's look at what you're actually communicating to a student in that moment if you help them before they actually request it. What it means is that they can show frustrated body language and somebody comes in and solves their problem. That can be dangerous. We actually need to be fostering this sense of communication and the ability to advocate for yourself when you need help. This is a really passionate area of mine in education, so I could talk about this for a really long time, because learned helplessness is something that serves nobody except the ego of the leader. And I don't think ego has any place in a leadership position. I think we need to be developed beyond ego if you are attempting to lead anybody anywhere, because it has nothing to do with you. So my next point here is controlling teaching, and we've kind of been talking about that a little bit, but self-determination theorists now endorse the dual process model, in which autonomy supportive teaching galvanizes the brighter side of students' motivation, so things like being satisfied with your autonomy and functioning with things like engagement, while controlling teaching galvanizes the darker side of students' motivation. So these are things like autonomy frustration, functioning, antisocial behavior. So you can start to see the way in which your personal tone and tenor, who you are as a human being showing up in the world has such a big impact on those we're around. And that of course doesn't sound surprising. We know that. But the hard part is figuring out how we show up and who we are as people, as educators, as leaders in the world. I really do believe that leadership and therapy do go hand in hand, because if you don't know who you are on a fundamental level emotionally, you are not prepared to lead anybody anywhere. Ooh, I didn't think I'd feel so passionate about this one, but here we are. Okay, personality limitations. So this is quite closely related, but let's look at it. Agreeableness, being open to new experiences, being invested in personal growth, all predict which teachers are most likely to harbor an autonomous, supportive, motivating style with their students. Conversely, authoritarianism is the belief that subordinates should submit to and obey authority figures. Out of this belief, authoritarian teachers emphasize conformity to prevailing social norms, submission to legitimate authority, and the necessity of using coercion to ensure conformity. It's a rough one, and we've seen those examples. I'm sure we've had those examples, unfortunately. On a personal note, I was the student that confronted authority. I was the student that questioned authority. I made a lot of really egoic teachers upset in my school experience. Well, as a teacher, I suppose, but not. I was a lot more aware of my own bias there by the time I was in my early 20s and being a classroom teacher. But as a middle school student, I had no idea why so many teachers were frustrated with me, and so many of them just loved to argue with me. I thought it was more personal versus their own bias and how they thought motivational styles would work for other students. Anyway, so in terms of the malleability of autonomy supportive teaching, the control causality orientation has emerged as the most prevalent personality-based limiting condition to the intervention effect. So this is because teachers who embrace a relatively high control causality orientation have difficulty seeing the connection between autonomy supportive teaching and gains in students' classroom motivation and engagement. So in my research while creating the outline for this video, I was looking up ways that we can foster these autonomous inclusive environments in our classrooms. And there's a lot out there. But I think a lot of them are missing the point. And let me explain to you what I mean. So the first one that I wrote down here as an example of things that you can do to support this is a get to know you activity where students share their hobbies and personal stories. And yes, that can foster relatedness because relatedness is important. The next one is provide project-based learning, where students choose between various topics or formats to present their understanding. So this is what I was explaining before of what I did in the classroom. Very good. But it's missing something again. And the last one we're going to talk about is scaffolding learning. So this is breaking down a big project into little surmountable chunks. So you're not looking up the big staircase of achievement, wondering how you're ever going to get there. It's just one step at a time, right? All of these things. So promoting the sense of community with personal stories. Awesome. Providing choice within projects and learning. Awesome. Scaffolding your learning. Awesome. What are they all missing? Who you are as a person. Are you listening? Do you actually have an interest in the human being sitting in front of you right now? Are you tuned into the novelty of the human experience of relating to other people? Because I find a lot of us aren't. So you can scaffold things, you can ask kids to tell their personal stories, you can, what's the third one? You can provide choices in projects, but if you're not present and authentic, none of that is going to mean anything. There are so many variables within our world of why people cannot be present. I've had those experiences in my time in a classroom. There have been times where my personal life has precluded me from being present while working with students, because if I was present, I would burst into tears, to be honest, right? We've all had those moments where we bring in things from outside the school doors into the school, because you cannot separate who you are as a human being from how you show up as a teacher. And that's the really big thing right there. So to be able to be present and actually listening to your students, I think is more important, or rather makes strategies like providing choice, creating community, and scaffolding your learning, make that actually valuable. So here's my example. How do I say this? I'm weird. And that's branding that I'm okay with. And for most of my educational career as a teacher, I had the weird class. And they didn't show up weird because it was this creation of authenticity that deemed us as weird. It never came from me. It usually never originated with the students that were in my class. It came from around. It would come from administrators. It would come from other teachers and other students. People would start to notice a distinct difference between the way most of my students would interact with their surroundings. And it was in a weird, analytical, full of the sense of novelty way that distinguished them from other people. It was this sense of presence. It was this sense of interest in things that seemingly were uninteresting to the rest of the world. And that's because of who I am as a person that was inherently being transposed onto the behavior of my students. And this happens for good or for bad, because we see these examples. Short-tempered teachers usually foster short-tempered students, right? No matter what you are and what you bring to the table, that usually will be influential to the students that you have. Okay, I'm getting off track. Back to my example. Grade 8, I had a teacher. Everybody loved him. Everybody loved him. I loved all of his classes. He was my homeroom teacher. And one of the biggest reasons that I loved the instruction of this man is because I got to feel like I was lazy in his class. I got to feel like I could get away with doing nothing. And while on the surface that doesn't necessarily sound positive, I was actually doing probably some of the most important work of my entire K-12 experience in that classroom, because we would just talk. As a class, we would talk. About what? Who knows? I don't remember. Everything. Because all of these things that were taking place in these seemingly pointless conversations that would take class upon class were the personification of these topics that we've been talking about here. Conversation skills, being present, listening to other people, being able to share our stories and frustrations and building this sense of community. That's what was happening in these classes. So while we as 13-year-olds were sitting back going, yeah, we got away with him. Ask him another personal question so he'll talk with us for another 30 minutes so we don't have to do math. Yes, there is a time and place for math, and I'll concede in that you need to know algebra, even though I don't fully believe that. But that's not the point, because who he was as a person who was fundamentally interested in his students began to create a relationship amongst his students that took us so much farther than the other teachers who had the most beautiful lesson plans ever and most educationally informed neuroscientific ways of understanding the life cycle of a bird and all of these things. Like, awesome. Are we actually enjoying our time in your class? That's what this all comes down to. And I began to teach the same way. And it's really important when we start to have this conversation about relatedness and scaffolding in a classroom, not only from a interpersonal perspective, but from a educational perspective of actually acquiring new knowledge, is that once you have enough understanding of who your students are as people and the variables that they have in their lives, you can start to connect things that are, for lack of a better word, super weird. So my example is one of my students in one of my years had a hamster, and that hamster's name was Simon. And when I tell you that Simon came up in conversation and lesson plans at least weekly for the entire school year, the kids just really embraced that. We even met Simon one day. That was a new experience for me, bringing in a hamster for the class. That was something. Anyway, not the point. Once I got to know this kid's hamster named Simon, and that your sister went to school with that brother, and oh yeah, I went to that mountain too last summer, and here's my picture. Get your mom to send me your picture from that mountain ice field tour, and we'll put it on the board, and then we're making slideshows because I'm a content creator, so I take pictures and videos, and then I spend way too much time editing it. I know, you have no idea. Putting it together, and then we show that, then we're watching it at lunch, and then relationship. It all builds on itself, but it all comes down to being present in the moment and actually being a human being interacting with other people. I knew I was passionate about this, but the fact that I've been recording for almost 40 minutes now really reinforces the fact that not only am I very passionate about this, but I do have, I don't know if it's something teachable. I think it's something teachable. I've heard from my administrators and from parents and colleagues that I have a unique gift to be able to relate to students. And I don't know if it's nature versus nurture. I don't know if I've been pushed here to this position because of my life experiences, or if it was just the way that I was born. Now that I say it out loud, I don't think it's the way you're born. I think it's the way that you interact with people. Having models in your life who show you this kind of behavior can be very important and influential, but I think at some point it does have to be on you as a human being to, at a base level, go to therapy. Because if you're a working teacher in Alberta, you get therapy. Go use it. If I see another unused pool of psychology money, I'm gonna lose it. Okay, this is becoming quite colloquial. Okay, so we have two things left to talk about here. Let's go. So according to Dewey, interest is an active state. To be interested is to be absorbed in, wrapped up in, carried away by some object. To take an interest is to be on the alert, to care about, to be attentive, and is manifested through engagement. Previous research has suggested that teacher autonomy support is positively associated with students' mastery goals. So like we talked about last time too, you can't expect teachers to be giving something to their students like supporting their autonomy without principals supporting the autonomy of teachers, and without school boards supporting the autonomy of principals, and without departments of education supporting the autonomy of school boards. And while there does have to be regulation throughout the entire pyramid of the educational system in order to maintain the safety of everybody involved, there are a lot of places where things are quite rigid when they could be flexible. And a lot of that has to do with the lasting legacy of colonization and Eurocentrism. Full stop, really. I don't have anything to add to that. That is the structure of which most of our education system was built in, and it continues to not work, but for reasons we're not going to get into, they still remained unsolved. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about here are the effects of rewards when it comes to internal and external motivation. So when you are fostering internal motivation, external rewards can create a bridge to intrinsic motivation. It is possible. For example, rewarding effort rather than outcomes can reinforce the value of persistence and self-improvement. So this is like what we've talked about before. If you're going to be giving out rewards, make sure you're not doing it for a beautiful finished product that may have been done by somebody's mother on their kitchen table and then schlepped into school to get an A+ and a sticker for. It's me. I was that student because my mom was a teacher who wanted me to do well in school, and how was I going to do best in school if I didn't do the work myself? But that's not a unique experience. That happens everywhere all the time. Whew. So if you are rewarding the effort, it actually can move you closer to that internal motivation. But when we talk about hindering internal motivation, over-reliance on external rewards, particularly if they're given for basic tasks, can undermine that intrinsic motivation. So students can become to view learning as something they do for rewards rather than for personal satisfaction. This makes everything very transactional, and there's expectations, and then there's disappointments when those expectations are not met, and it doesn't create a positive learning environment. Okay, that brings me to the end of my script here, and while I filmed a lot longer than I thought I would, I do want to reiterate how important this concept is to me as an educator, and how important I believe it is that who you are as a person and how you show up in the classroom cannot be separated from who you are as a human being. Those two things are inherently connected. And if you're attempting to mask yourself in any sort of way and build up a wall between you and your students, you effectively will not only be able to not reach them, you won't be able to model to them how to reach each other. It's super interesting because all of this seemingly falls under the hidden curriculum, because nobody taught me this. Nobody taught me this in university. Nobody taught me this in my undergraduate degree, but I did go and figure this out on my own. And it is very self-gratifying to be able to read it in the research and know that what I was doing and how different I was from most of my colleagues when I was a teacher. It's satisfying to see that, it really is. But on the same token, it is quite sad because I think there are a lot of societal limitations, like I briefly mentioned before, but there are so many reasons why a teacher could not support autonomy in a classroom because of all of the variables and experiences we face as a human being and a teacher. And I think that's really sad and does a disservice to students all around our world. So yeah, I think everybody needs to go to therapy. Autonomy is important. That's all I got. Thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate your time. And until the next one, goodbye.